Hello and welcome to the Horns and Whistles Workshop YouTube channel. My name is Mark. Thanks for joining me on this video, which is a product demonstration or an instructional video on how to fit the Triang Hornby Silver Seal CD motor upgrade kits, which is one of these. You may well have found this video by following a link on the eBay listing of this product, and this video partly serves as the instructions of how to fit it. This kit consists of just a few components, which I will open up and show you. So you have a 12-volt CD motor already fitted inside a 3D printed fitting adapter sleeve. You have a little pinion gear there and a length of heat shrink tubing. So not an awful lot in terms of components, and to be fair, the fitting process for this is a relatively simple one, and my intention is to just demonstrate how it all fits together. So I'm just going to move all this to one side and bring back my model. So I've got myself a nice little Triang evening star locomotive, which I picked up on eBay, which I'm going to take the tender body off and fit the motor, and we'll give the motor, or the model, sorry, a bit of a clean and lubrication as well while we're at it. Tools wise, you're going to need a soldering iron and some solder, a set of sort of small screwdrivers. It's always handy to have a set of, or a pair of tweezers, and some sort of pair of needle nose pliers if you've got them handy. And if you've got them, wire strippers are a very good idea. If you haven't got wire strippers, then you can use something like a very sharp craft blade to strip back some of the wire when it comes to soldering. I'll be using the wire strippers, and I'll put a link to those in the video description down below, as well as a link, of course, to the actual CD motor kit if you wish to go and buy one. So the first thing I need to do is remove the tender body. Now this, on this particular model, is a little bit of a faff. What I'm going to use is just a little foam servicing cradle to turn the body or the locomotive over. So you'll see here a couple of things worth pointing out. Move it into shot properly. So on the underside here, you've got the pickups. There's pickups on both sides, and there's pickups on that pair of axles there and that pair of axles there. So each rail has got 4 points of pickup. Those pickups have these two wires here. There's a brown one and a black one soldered to them, and those wires lead into the tender where the motor is, and it's those wires that we're going to need to connect to our new motor to obviously feed the power to the new motor. Now what we need to do is separate the tender from the locomotive by undoing this screw here on the drawbar. But what we obviously need to be careful of is that when we do that, we don't move the tender away from the locomotive before we've detached these wires from the motor, because otherwise you risk breaking the wire or breaking the solder joint, or breaking, even worse, breaking the actual pickup. So just be mindful of that. So what I'm going to do is, with a small flat-headed screwdriver, I'll undo one of those screws there. So one of the screws on the drawbar on the tender end, I'm just going to undo, and I'm going to put the screw in a little pot that I've got off camera here, and then I can take that servicing cradle off. Now what this model has got as well is, on the tender there are two tiny screws holding the body on. So there is, and they're cross-headed screws, not flat-headed. So there's one here, which again I'll put in a little pot, and then a ridiculously small one, which you might not even be able to see on camera. You can just about see the little silver screw head there. It's such a small little screw. In fact, that screwdriver's going to be way too big. This is the smallest cross-headed screwdriver I've got, and that is undoing that screw, thankfully. In fact, what I'm going to need to do is use a pair of pliers to pull that out, because I can see from where I'm looking that even though I'm unscrewing it, it's just spinning freely. So it's obviously stripped to thread, so that's pulled out nice and easily. I don't think I'll bother putting that one back in, if I'm honest. And then on this particular model, I've got the ladders at the back, which I need to be mindful of. On your model, just have a look at what you've got and what needs removing. And there you have the exposed tender chassis with the motor in here. Obviously, we've got this big weight here, which we're going to need to remove. We will keep that and reuse that. There are 2 flat-headed screws on the top there. One out in my pot. And again, making sure, even though the tender and locomotive are disconnected by everything other than those 2 little wires, that the tender and the locomotive stay next to each other until we have had an opportunity to disconnect the 2 wires from there. Now what I'm going to do, as you saw, the new motor comes with a good couple of inches of wire. I don't actually need to keep all of that wire that's already on the locomotive, so rather than trying to get my soldering iron in here to desolder it, because I can't remove the plastic cowling until I've removed the wire, I'm just going to cut them, and then I can feed that wire through there, move the locomotive out of the way, and here I have my tender chassis, and then the cowling will, with a little bit of a fiddle, come off. Now here is your Silver Seal motor. Now the Silver Seal motor is held on with 3 screws, one there, one there, one there. So you've got 3 flat-headed screws. The crux of this job is remove those 3 screws, remove everything that they attach, fit the new motor kit and refit those 3 screws, and that's pretty much it. So it's not complicated. So I'll take those away. Now on this model, those 3 screws are identical, so it doesn't matter if you get them mixed up at all. And the next thing you need to do is just some of this is obviously fallen away already, which is fine. The rest of it we need to remove. It may just need a bit of a wiggle to get it. In fact, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove that wheel. So using 2 flat-headed screwdrivers, just put them behind the wheel, and then at the same time turn the screwdrivers to lift the wheel out. You should never ever prise a wheel off with just 1 screwdriver, because if you try and get and I'm not going to take these wheels off, but just for demonstration, if I put my screwdriver under there and try and prise that to get that wheel off, all I'm going to do is bend the axle. Whereas if you put 2 underneath directly opposite each other and then twist so they go from flat to upright, that will mean that the wheel or the axle is lifted from both sides evenly, so it all remains straight. So I've got my wheel there and I've got my wheel there, and the gear fell off. That's not a problem. Now you can see that the motor with the magnet, the armature and the gear and the housing just comes off, and you're left with a bare chassis. And all we're going to do is... Now the very eagle-eyed amongst you will not only identify that not only has several parts of the old motor vanished off of my work surface, but the colour of my sleeves has changed. If I can get them into camera shot. A second ago you'll have seen me fiddling with this wearing brown sleeves, and now I'm wearing black. That's what happens when you wake up the next day after filming your video and you realise that you have forgotten a significant section of what you intended to include. But thanks to modern video editing software, I don't have to start from the beginning. I can just pick up where I left off, include the and do the bit that I missed out, and slice it into the video, so no harm done. So having removed the motor from the chassis, what we're now going to do is carry on with some disassembly so that we can remove the wheels and the gears to give the wheels and the gears a good clean and a decent bit of lubrication. Now let me just get my light on there properly so you can see it. So what we have is 2 single gears, so one of them here and one of them here, and then above the single gear, or one of the single gears, is a little double gear here that's held on with a little circlip. Now, I don't intend to remove the gear with the circlip, purely because I don't have circlip pliers. Now, it is entirely possible to prise it off with a screwdriver, but the last thing I want to do is break it or encourage you to do anything that could result in it getting broken. So we're going to leave this single gear on, but what we'll do is remove both axles. We've already obviously removed the middle axle, and then remove these gears, give them all a clean, lubricate everything, and then reassemble it, including the new motor. So to remove the axles on the extremities, it's exactly the same process. 2 screwdrivers opposite each other, and rotate them outwards and upwards so that the wheel lifts off, and then once it's lifted off, it will, it's popped out of its housing. Let's put that back in, and there we go. And then that single gear has fallen off, which is handy. And then do the same with this wheel here. So that one's with that one, that one's with that one, and that one is with that one. And we've got a single gear here, and then the other single gear will come off. Now I'm just going to get a bit of rag here, dry bit of rag, there's nothing on it, and just wipe the gears just to make sure there's no dust on them. Let me just move my camera angle up slightly. And wipe, yeah, give both gears a wipe and a clean, and then give the chassis a bit of a wipe and a clean. And particularly the pivot points where the gears go under, these 2 little brass spindles there, give them a wipe and a clean as well. And that single gear as well, just give it a wipe over, make sure there's no dust or fluff caught in it. Having given them a wipe, I'm just going to bring my oil dropper in, and the first gear I'm going to oil is this double gear here. Now, it is possible to oil it without removing it, just by putting a drop of oil right where the gear rotates over the shaft or the spindle. And with a bit of capillary action, that oil, as you spin the gear, will get in the space between that gear and the shaft, and that's absolutely fine. And then I'm just going to put a little bit of oil on these 2 little brass spindles here. Less is more, you don't need much at all really, just a little bit of oil is enough. I'll just move that to one side, and I'm just going to use my cloth to wipe the axles, and then again put a tiny bit of oil on the axle itself, not much, just a small bit, keeping those wheels in their pairs. That way, by doing this, you'll make sure that when you do fit your new motor, it will run as sort of best as it possibly can, really. Right, and now what we can do is start to reassemble that motor. So if I move my screwdrivers over to one side, I'll move my chassis and my wheels, and that, keeping them in their pairs, over to one side, and the gear over to one side. I'll bring in the motor here and the pinion gear. What we're going to do is fit the pinion gear onto the shaft of the motor before we fit the motor to the chassis. It will make life a lot easier in the long run. Now the pinion gears are made of plastic, but it is a really tight fit. So what I would suggest you do is put the motor on a flat surface, and then put the gear on top like that, and then just rotate it round almost on the shaft, almost just to open up. That's it, and then it just slid on there. Now what you need to do is, in the box that you received your parcel in, your motor in, you received a business card. Now I clearly need to tighten this up a bit, don't I? Now I would use that business card as a spacer to get the spacing between the pinion gear and the motor. because you need to push the gear down into the motor, but you don't want the gear to touch the motor, otherwise you're going to end up with the gear binding against the motor. You also don't want it protruding too much, because if you have it like that, you know, really sticking out off of the motor shaft, you'll find that when you reassemble everything, the gear will actually rub and bind on the bodywork of the tender or the inside of the weight. So it needs to be pushed nicely onto the shaft, really close to the motor but not touching it. So in order to achieve that, I'm just going to slide the business card underneath it and then push it right down with my thumb. And I might even need to use an open pair of pliers. Open it over the shaft, hold the business card in place, and then push down until it's pinching the business card, and then pull the business card out, and you'll find that that spins freely, but it's obviously really, really close to the body of the motor, and that's ready to refit back into the chassis. Now, it has a correct way up, so the wires go to the top, and you'll see that one of the sides of the 3D printed adapter is flat. That goes at the bottom. So it goes that way up, and then the 3 little screw holes here in the chassis will line up with the backs of the 3 little screw holes in the motor adapter, and they will just sort of slot over and click into place, just like that. And then the 3D printed adapter, when it's fitted correctly, is sitting flush against the metal of the chassis. There's no gap like that. It's sitting completely flush. And then bringing the 3 screws back in that we took off when we removed the old motor. Just going to put the 3 screws, one in each of those holes, and do them up. There you go, that's the motor fitted. Now the last thing I'm going to do is just push the motor inwards so that it's not sticking out too much, because if you have the motor body sticking out too much, you'll find that when you put this centre axle back in, the wheels will rub against the bottom of the motor. But as long as you push the motor in as far as it will go, and that one is, then there won't be any rubbing. And you'll find, having put that motor in, that gear, those 2 gears, the pinion gear and the double gear that's held on with the circlip, engage nicely. So now what we've got to do is refit the wheels, which is a nice and simple process. So I'm going to put the single gears on first. Now these do have a right and a wrong way. Again, you'll find that on one side there is a number embossed. This one's got the number 1 embossed. That number faces in towards the chassis. And then I'm going to slide the axle through the hole, and then take the wheel that came off the other side of that axle and just push it on with my thumb and forefinger. And you want to make sure that there's a little bit of play like that, but not so much of a gap that that gear disengages. Now, while we're talking about the wheels, or thinking about the wheels are of 2 different types, which is why I paired them. The wheels that go sort of at the front and the rear have got a flange on them. The wheels that go in the middle don't. So you can tell the difference, and you need to keep them paired like that. So I'm going to put the single gear on again, the number inwards, the wheel through, and then put the wheel on the other side just by pinching it on with my thumb and forefinger. Again, making sure that that gear is engaging. There's a bit of play, but not so much that that gear is going to start disengaging. And then finally the centre wheel will go in. The gear on that centre wheel will join all of these gears together. So if I turn one, now everything turns, and then obviously I'll put that other wheel on the centre axle, and then just having a look, make sure that all the gauging looks about right. Obviously if you have a gauging tool, that will help you, and you can use a ruler to check the back-to-back spacing as well, which should be about 14.5, 15 mil is what I normally go for. and that all looks about right to me. So there is the motor installed. Gears are all running smoothly and nicely. It's all been lubricated and oiled, and it is ready to move on to reassembly of the tender and the locomotive. Now, in terms of reassembly, first thing we need to do is put the tender cowling back on. Now, this has a correct way round, so you'll see at the bottom edge here, it's a slightly longer slot than it is at the top edge. That longer slot is there to accommodate the gears, so it needs to go that way round. So you put your wires through the opening and then just drop it down on top, and it will just sit there quite nicely. I'm going to turn that around because I'm right-handed. So the next thing we're going to do is reattach the wire from the locomotive to the wire from the tender. Now, as you'll have seen when I took it apart, there's a little hole in the bottom of the tender housing just here, but there's two holes. There's one there, that's the screw hole for the drawbar, and then the second hole back is where the wires from the locomotive are going to feed through. They're going to come up here, and then I'm going to solder them to these two wires. Now, it's going to be a little bit tricky because obviously at this point we haven't put the weight back on, so the tender housing is still loose. So I'm just going to try and hold it on with my fingers and then feed those two wires through that hole. And through they go. Thankfully, or in fact, no, through one of them goes. There we go. Through they go, just grab them through with pliers. In fact, that black wire still hasn't gone through. That's being a bit reluctant, isn't it? It's not bent the right way, that's why. There we go. Right, through they are, and then I'm just going to pull them through with my pliers and make sure they stay through as I rotate the tender the right way up. So I've now got two wires here. I've got my black wire and my brown wire from the locomotive, and then my two wires from the motor. Now, in terms of polarity, you need to connect the red motor wire to the black locomotive wire, and the black motor wire to the brown locomotive wire, to make sure that the model runs in the correct direction given the polarity of your controller. So we'll attach those wires, and what I'll do is I'll just attach one on camera, and then I'll go and do the other one off camera because it's both the same process and you don't want to watch me soldering for 5 minutes. That's quite boring. So I'm going to strip back the brown wire from the locomotive, and then that's going to attach to the black wire here, which I'm going to shorten because I don't need all of that flex. So I'm just going to hold it up, give it an extra centimetre or so, and cut it there, and strip that wire back. Now, bringing in the heat shrink tubing, I'm just going to cut a centimetre or so off and slide it over the black wire of the motor. You need to make sure that you slide your heat shrink tubing over one of the wires before you do your solder joints, because once you've joined the wires, of course, you can't then slide the heat shrink over one of the wires. Now, this is the fiddly bit. So I'm going to hold these two wires together with my tweezers so that the exposed metal, or the bare wire, is they're lined up, and then using my thumb and forefinger, twist them together. That's it, like that, reasonably tightly, so that when I let go, they still stay together. But what I do need to do is apply some solder to make sure that they are properly connected and secure and not going to come apart, and you get good power transference as well. Let's get rid of that excess. There we go. And then if I just fold the solder joint over towards the brown wire, because the brown wire is thinner, I can then slide my heat shrink tubing over that solder joint like so, and then very carefully, to make sure that I don't melt anything else, I'm just going to warm up the heat shrink tubing with the shaft, if you like, of my soldering iron, but you must be very careful when you do this, because otherwise you risk melting stuff that you don't want to melt. So there you go, that's heated up and shrunk the heat shrink tubing over that. The process for the red wire attaching it to the black wire is exactly the same, so bear with me, I'll be back in a minute when I've done that. Right, so now all of the wires are connected, I need to put the weight back on. Now the weight, just like the tender cowling, has got a correct way round. You can see the bottom of it has got a longer slot than the top. So the longer slot side goes over the gears. So I need to turn that round, and you'll see on the bottom there is a cutout or a slot there, which is for the wires. So these wires here will hopefully fairly naturally fall as I put it down into that slot there, which they do. And then I can bring the screws back in and screw that down. Don't need to be too tight, thumb and forefinger tight is fine. So there we go. So having done that, I'm just going to put the tender cover, the tender body back on. It just sort of drops on quite nicely, and then I've got those two little screws to refit. I had said at the beginning that that tiny little silver screw I wasn't going to bother putting back on, but having thought about it, I will, even if it isn't threaded properly and it just pushes into place. At least it will prevent the tender cover or the tender body from lifting. So I'll just refit that little one. And that screw literally does just push in. There we go. So the final job is just to reattach the drawbar to the tender. So if I put this in a servicing cradle and then bring in my screw. Now this can be a little bit fiddly because obviously the drawbar is sort of loose and free. So if I line it up with my tweezers roughly, and then bring the screw in, and then actually use the screw to do the sort of final lining up. So push the screw through the hole in the drawbar and then use that to find the threaded hole in the tender chassis, and then tighten that up. There we go. That is the installation complete. So a reasonably simple job. Take the tender apart, take the old motor out with the 3 screws, fit the new motor back in with the same 3 screws, feed the feed wires through, attach them by soldering, and then reassemble the locomotive. Nice and simple. So the last thing we're going to do is put it on the test track and give it a run. Okay, so here we are with Evening Star on the test track. What I'll do is I'll just slowly crank up the power, so you can see that these new motors give you a really nice slow speed, smooth crawl, which wouldn't have been achievable with the original motor, and is a massive performance upgrade, and also just give you a flavour of what the top speed is like. So that was up to top speed at the end of that, and let's give it a crawl back. There's ever such a slight stiff spot in the running gear of this model, but as you can see, that is a massive upgrade in terms of slow speed performance, and the running speed at the top end of the speed scale as well is nice and realistic. It's not too fast. So there you go. I hope that's been a useful video for you. I hope that has enabled you or helped you to fit your Silver Seal motor upgrade and ultimately give your aging model a new lease of life. Thanks for watching.